Greetings, my name is Christopher Paisley, a Philadelphia public school teacher for Inside White Fragility. Today I'd like to look at systemic racism versus systemic voter fraud. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the points that are involved with systemic racism, and I'm going to apply them to this idea of systemic voter fraud. Now, we hear all the time about these possibilities of the systemic racist culture of white supremacy in the United States, but then when you bring up the idea of systemic voter fraud in the United States, there's a completely different reaction, especially in the mainstream. All right, so I'm going to look at both, and I'm going to take the concepts that are applied with systemic racism, and I'm going to apply them to systemic voter fraud, and we're going to see how they add up next to each other. All right, so the first point is this. There is systemic racism in America. That's been stated. So that's point number one, the existence of these things. All right, so when someone says, yes, there's systemic racism in the United States, they always talk about the history. All right, if you look at the American history of racism, you're going to see that there's definitely historical racism in the United States. And no one's going to deny that, and that's true. But the second part is that this racism has not ended, but it's simply changed forms. All right, that's where people might disagree. There's not really been much progress. This racism is all there under the surface, but it's simply changed forms. So let's take that idea and apply it to voter fraud. All right, let's say this. There is systemic voter fraud in the United States today. There's a history of voter fraud, and there's a history of political corruption. And one example of many is a book by a man named Lincoln Steffens called Shame of the Cities, where they go over, multiple cities like Minneapolis and Philadelphia and New York and Chicago, and they get into the pay-to-play culture and the corruption in Philadelphia with the power company and the water company and all the craziness in Chicago and all the craziness in New York, where they were creating a system of government to keep the power structure in place. If you were to say that, yeah, there's a history of political corruption in the big cities in the United States, no one would deny that. Now, what if you said the same thing that you say about systemic racism, and you say, this corruption has not ended, it's simply changed forms? Okay, how willing would you be to accept that definition? All right, so let's look at something else. Let's look at the idea in terms of systemic racism that racial disparities are the sole result of racism. All right, so when you say, well, how is there systemic racism? And they say, well, the disparity itself is the evidence of racism. All right, for example, African-American males are 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled as their white counterparts. So you say, all right, well, the teachers like me would say, well, where's the racism? Where's the evidence of these teachers disciplining these students differently in terms of the things that they're doing? And they go, well, look at the disparity. They're suspended 3 times as much. And then you say, all right, well, give me the specifics, and they just keep pointing back to the disparity. So what if we said the same thing for voter fraud? There's systemic voter fraud in the United States. And then people would say, well, give me the evidence. And I said, well, the disparity itself is the evidence. The fact that Trump was winning all of these states, at the beginning of the night, and then come the light of day, it all flipped around by hundreds of thousands of votes. And you say, well, the disparity is the evidence of fraud. Now, how strong is that argument when you apply it to both things? It makes you think. All right. The next thing is this. When you're talking about systemic racism, all whites are inherently racist. Okay. Not some whites, not good whites, bad whites, whatever, because of the good-bad binary of racism. All whites are inherently racist. White silence perpetuates racism, this inherent white supremacy culture. It keeps it in place. Okay, this silence enables whites to benefit from white privilege, which all whites do benefit from just by being white. It doesn't matter your social class or your geographic region. All whites have white privilege. And ultimately, all whites suffer from anti-blackness. Whether they know it or not, whether they have animosity towards people of color or not, all whites suffer from anti-blackness. All right, let's apply this to this idea of systemic voter fraud in the United States. What if I made this blanket statement? All Democrats are corrupt. Especially all Democrat vote counters in these cities are all inherently corrupt, and they're creating this systemic voter fraud, okay? And the fact that these people are silent is perpetuating this fraud. It's keeping it going throughout the cities, okay? The fact that they're silent is violent because it's perpetrating this voter fraud on the American people. The fact that all Democrats, or at least Democrat vote counters in these areas, they all have what is known as liberal privilege, okay? They're not questioned thoroughly by the media. They're not questioned thoroughly by big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Google. Okay, they have this liberal privilege, all of them do. Okay, and this enables them to keep this fraudulent systemic system in place. What if I said that all Democrats suffer from anti-conservatism? Okay, they all have this anti-conservative bias deep down. And if you said to a person who believed that they were just an honest, genuine, good Democrat, and you said, nah, you're anti-conservative, you hate all conservatives, you might not know it, but if you were honest with yourself and you went deep down, you're anti-conservative. Would that make sense? All right. So let's look at the idea of implicit bias. All whites have implicit bias, right? When white people are within society in America, they perpetuate the system of white supremacy, but they're not doing it consciously. And if you said to a white person, why do you do these things? Why do you do these racist things? And a white person said, well, I don't think I do them. I don't feel like I do them. And you'd say, well, not consciously, but unconsciously, the decisions that you make is creating this culture of white supremacy. What if I said that all Democrats suffer from implicit bias, especially vote counters? Okay, when you're counting the vote, you might think that you're being fair. You might think that you're looking at signatures or postmarks or the fact that it came past the deadline fairly, but in reality, unconsciously, you're really navigating this through a point of systemic fraud. And we know that when we really looked at these results closely, that there's going to be this evidence of fraud because you're implicitly biased. Would that argument make sense? Would people buy that? All right. What if I said that when we're talking about systemic racism, there's this idea that whites commit constant microaggressions, right? White people, through their attitudes, through their socialization in society, when they interact with people of color, they'll insult them. They may dominate the conversation. They may do these things that constantly is making people of color feel unwanted or feel slighted or feel upset or triggered. And if you asked whites, why are they doing this? They would say, well, I don't feel like I'm doing this. Well, they say, you know what, you're suffering. It's a microaggression. It's not the person interpreting the behavior. Like it might be a person of color who might be extra sensitive. It's not that. It's the fact that the white is being overly offensive. What if we applied that to systemic voter fraud in the United States? What if we said all Democrats, or especially Democrat poll watchers, suffered from these microaggressions? When conservatives or Republican poll watchers wanted to come inside and look at these counts, they've been met with these microaggressions and accused of these things, and they've been denied access. Would that be a legitimate argument? What if I said this when you look at systemic racism? According to Ibram X. Kendi, you're either racist or you're anti-racist. There is no neutral. Okay, so if you disagree with me, you have a different opinion or different viewpoint, you, my friend, are a racist. I'm going to label you this. What if we looked at that in terms of voter suppression? What if I said you're either for fraud or you're against fraud? There is no in between. Do you agree with me that there is this systemic voter fraud in the United States, especially in these Democrat cities? Do you believe that? No? Well, then you're supporting fraud. Then the only thing that can be concluded is that you support fraud and you are not trying to bring about truth. How would you feel about that? All right. What if I said this? If you deny, when we're talking about systemic racism now, if you deny racism, you suffer from white fragility, right? If you deny racism, you disagree, you suffer from white fragility, according to Robin DiAngelo. And what if I said DiAngelo just came up with this concept? You know, she wrote a couple of journal articles, a couple papers. She did her dissertation, and then she did a paper on this with no real quantitative evidence. She didn't have quantitative evidence. She didn't do studies. She didn't have a scientific hypothesis and use the scientific method. If you look at her dissertation and her papers on this, she's done minimal anecdotal observation evidence with this qualitative studies that never really attempted to prove the concept false. It does not meet the principle of falsification because all she does is try and prove it true. All right. How can you have a concept that you can't prove false? You can only prove it true. Okay. White fragility exists. And if you try and prove it false, you suffer from it. Okay. Imagine that. And then let's apply this to the idea of something called woke fragility. Okay. That if you deny voter fraud, you deny voter suppression, especially in big Democrat cities, that you suffer from woke fragility. Now, I don't have any science to back this up, but it's just anecdotal observations. I've seen it on TV. I've seen the poll watchers not being able to get into polls. So that's what you suffer from if you disagree with me. How would that sound in terms of a legitimate argument? Okay. So if you look at this idea of systemic racism in the United States, the history and all of the concepts of it, and the fact that it's not ended but just changed forms, and you go through anti-racism and white fragility and all these things, implicit bias, microaggressions, anti-blackness, and you were to take all that and you were to say, hey, let's talk about systemic voter fraud and all of these things, how ridiculous does it sound when you compare it, or maybe how true does it sound? But the funny part about it is this. You have an entire segment of the population who's going to insist that you have this systemic racism, but they're going to look the other way and deny that there's this systemic voter fraud.